Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with David Edmonds. Dave is the co-host of the Philosophy Bites podcast, as well as the best-selling author of numerous books about philosophy, including most recently, Death in a Shallow Pond, A Philosopher, A Drowning Child, and Strangers in Need. In this delightful book, Dave explores the shallow pond thought experiment of the philosopher Peter Singer, its implications, and the impact it has had due to the effective altruism movement. It is a fascinating biography of a thought experiment and an analysis of its ideas. Dave and I had a chance to examine the nature of the shallow pond experiment, its path from moral philosophy to practical impact in effective altruism, the demandingness of the shallow pond, counter-arguments that might be compelling, the EA movement's shift to long-termism and focus on AI and existential risk, why EA is disliked, and even the impact of thought experiments in the world more broadly. This conversation was fantastic, and I had a great time speaking with Dave. Let's jump in. Dave, wonderful to be chatting with you, and thanks so much for joining the Orthogonal Bet.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, this is exciting. Your new book is fascinating. I love this idea of almost like a biography of a thought experiment. Maybe that would be actually the best place to start, which is, what is the shallow pond, the idea behind it, and what was Peter Singer's goal here with actually creating this thought experiment?
Okay, so I better tell you what the thought experiment is, and then I can tell you the background to it as well.
That is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so you are to imagine that you are walking to work and you walk past a shallow pond and you hear the cries of a child and you see the child is struggling in the shallow pond. You look around to see whether our parents are around, whether there's a guardian around, a nanny, an au pair, something like that. Nothing. You are the only person who can help this child in the shallow pond. You're about to wade in to save the child when you realize that you're wearing your most expensive shoes or a very expensive suit. Or perhaps, I don't know, you're wearing a gold Rolex that you can't remove in time. And if you go in, you'll also be late for work. So you're wondering whether you should save the child or worry about your expensive suit or worry about being late. And that's Peter Singer's thought experiment. And of course, everybody says that's absurd. No decent person could worry about their shoes when there's a life at stake. And then what Peter Singer claims is that all of us are in effect walking past a shallow pond every day of our lives. All people who are sufficiently sort of affluent that they could afford a certain amount of money to give away to charity, which the charity could use to save a life. Those of us who don't do that, who don't donate to, let's say, an international charity like Oxfam or Save the Children, those of us who don't do that are in effect like the person who walks past a shallow pond worrying about their Rolex or their suit rather than worrying about the child.
What was the origin there in terms of and it sounds like he was thinking also of a very specific moment in time in terms of there were certain activities happening in the world.
Peter Singer is at this stage a young Australian philosopher. The year is 1971. So he's in his late 20s. He's come from Australia to do a postgraduate degree in Oxford. He's just been awarded a 2-year lectureship at one of the colleges there, University College. And there's a new journal that just begins called Philosophy and Public Affairs, now a very influential journal. And one of the sort of founders of the journal, Ronnie Dworkin, who's a very famous kind of philosophical lawyer, who's also at University College at the time, says to Peter Singer, well, have you got any ideas? And at the time, there's a war going on in South Asia. There's the Bangladesh War of Liberation. We call it Bangladesh now. It was then East Pakistan, and it was breaking away from West Pakistan, which we now just call Pakistan. And there was a terrible civil war, and literally millions of people were crossing the border from Bangladesh into India. Many of them were starving. And Peter Singer's question was, well, what were our obligations? By our, I mean, what were the obligations of those people who lived in the West to these distant strangers who desperately needed help? India couldn't cope with the refugee crisis. It just didn't have the resources, for one thing. It was a very, very much poorer country then than it is today. And so Singer's question was, are we obligated to help?
And so, okay, so he wrote this article, published it about this, and kind of laid out this idea of the shallow pond. Immediately afterwards, what was the reaction to it? Did it kind of just sink without a trace, and maybe later on people began thinking about it? Like, how did people initially just respond to this idea?
Well, he had a very, very compelling argument. The basic argument was that if it's in our power to prevent something bad without costing us anything of any significance, then we ought to do it. Clearly, people dying is a very, very bad thing. Clearly, giving up a bit of money or worrying about one's suit is a trivial thing in comparison. So that was the basic argument. He's known as a utilitarian philosopher, and he is a utilitarian, and a utilitarian philosopher believes that you should try to maximize happiness or minimize pain. But this argument didn't rest on utilitarianism. It just rested on this very simple principle. If you can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of any significance, then you should do it. That's not really a utilitarian principle, but it's very compelling. So he had that principle. It was published in an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, and it quickly became of interest to philosophers. So in volumes of articles about moral philosophy, often it was selected as an article that students should read. It was often on reading lists, but it had no real effect beyond the world of philosophy for many decades. And it was really only 40 years on that it began to have an effect in the real world.
Yeah, and so and I assume the effect in the real world is kind of the origins of effective altruism. I don't know if you want to talk about how that, and maybe it was not just that, but my sense in reading your book, like that was kind of the origin of it kind of taking on a much more kind of practical real world impact. Yeah, maybe you can kind of talk about how people latched onto this as something that really needed to be used, that this idea needed to be used in some sort of very practical, realistic kind of way.
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, about 2005, in fact, a young philosopher, also at Oxford, also from Australia, called Toby Ord, he read this article, Famine, Affluence and Morality. He had to read it for an essay he was writing, and he found it very convincing. And then independently, another even younger philosopher, who was just a graduate at the time, Will MacAskill, he also read it and was very influenced by it. The two of them met, and they decided that rather than just be convinced by a philosophy article, they ought to put it into practice. I mean, Peter Singer had always argued that, as far as he was concerned, moral philosophy was not a game like chess or checkers. It ought to have real-world consequences. But his article hadn't really had those consequences until these young philosophers came along and started, as you mentioned, this movement which is known as effective altruism, which is now a worldwide movement. They gave Peter Singer's argument a twist. So they decided that not only was it important for each and every one of us if they could convince us to give away a portion of our income, they spotted something that Singer hadn't really paid much attention to, which was it was important that if you're going to donate, you should donate effectively. In fact, sometimes it mattered more what cause you gave than how much you gave, because the difference between very effective organizations and very ineffective organizations was absolutely vast. And if you pick the right organizations, then a small sum given to the right organization was worth a much larger sum given to a very ineffective organization. So that's something they began to look into. And the effective altruism movement consists of these two parts: effectiveness, which is the spin they gave in it, and the altruism part, which comes from this initial drowning pond, shallow pond example.
And so related to the altruism component, I mean, I think one of the innovations, maybe that's the wrong word, but like one of the things they noticed is that depending on the messaging, that had a really big kind of difference in impact, where like if you kind of use sort of the classic sort of Peter Singer shallow pond argument, maybe kind of based on guilt, made people feel bad, but maybe didn't necessarily cause them to change their action. And so the EA community started thinking more about kind of trying to get people excited about like, oh, like there's all these ways you can actually impact the world in positive ways. was that a big part of their success? And like, how did Peter Singer feel about that kind of shift? How do you think about that kind of shift? Or maybe I'm making too much of it.
No, I don't think you are. I mean, I think the example itself is actually quite convincing and can persuade people. But you're right in that if you try and guilt trip people, that can have a backlash effect. That isn't very effective. And if you say, here's a great opportunity, you can save lives. If you give 10% of your salary away, that can be much more effective. And given that the ultimate goal of effective altruism is to do as much good as they can, really what matters, I mean, they don't believe in lying, they don't believe in fraud, but blah, blah, blah. There are lots of side constraints, but what they ultimately care about is being as effective as possible. Now, I mentioned that earlier on that Peter Singer was a utilitarian. He signs up to that. I mean, if you said to everybody, you've got to give 90% of your money away, and people just found that impossible, psychologically impossible, and so they were put off from giving any money away, it would be much better to say you only have to give 10% of money away, which is still a heck of a lot, and like 9% more than most people give. If that's more persuasive in getting people to open their wallets, then that's the message you should send out, because the ultimate goal is to try and channel money into what they regard as worthy causes.
Okay. Yeah. And because that's a really interesting kind of take on this, because I feel like if you were confronted with the thought experiment of the shallow pond, I can see many people responding almost with this sense of overwhelming need to do something, and almost feeling that if you kind of take seriously the full force of the argument, that no matter what you're doing, that's never enough. And you can kind of always feel like you need to do more. And that can be extremely overwhelming and either put people off or maybe create some sort of like existential crisis for many people. You have to kind of pair it with this very practical aspect of saying, okay, what is actually the reasonable amount we can assume that people can actually kind of bear in terms of the amount they're going to donate or the amount of effort they're going to give. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot going on there. So
Yeah, sure. Feel
it's
free
the
to break
case.
it apart.
Yeah, well, it's the case, of course, that if you save one life, there's always another life to save. And that can feel overwhelming. But of course, if there are 100 lives to be saved and you save one life, well, that's one life better than nothing. But, psychologically, it can be off putting. There's the demandingness objection to the drowning child analogy, which is that, with the drowning child, you've just got one child and you just pass that one child on one day. But because the need that you mention is almost bottomless, really what you have to imagine is that you're passing struggling child every day of the week, as it were. So you go past a child on Tuesday, you wade in and you ruin your suit. Then you go past another child on the Wednesday who's struggling, you wade in and you ruin your Rolex. You go past another child on the Thursday or whatever, and there's always a drowning child. And people think, well, that's just too much to ask, because at every given moment, it always seems like the right thing to do to sacrifice your, if you can afford it, your suit for the child, or to sacrifice your watch for the child, and so on and so forth. But if you have to keep on doing that because there's always somebody who's in more need than you are, that just seems to ask too much. And that's both a philosophical puzzle about demandingness, about whether it's reasonable to demand that much from somebody. But also psychologically, it's an issue as well. It's just that, as you mentioned, that psychologically people just can't cope with the demand that's out there. And so they're likely to retrench and perhaps not do anything.
So, I mean, there's even separate from the psychological demandingness. Do you find the philosophical aspect of that compelling, or is it just simply, I mean, yeah, maybe people are never going to give up all of their money or things like that, but like clearly we all start from such a low foundation in terms of how much we're donating or giving, that we can always do a little bit more. And so it's not saying that therefore we should do as much as we can, kind of this unceasing demandingness. It's just simply do more. I mean, does this argument make sense from the point of the experiment?
The problem with the Singer shallow pond, well, whether it's a problem, it's not clear. I mean, people like Peter Singer embrace the conclusions, embrace the logic, as it were. So you give 10% of the way of your salary away. And then let's say you've still got a car. Well, you can get to work by tube. If the tubes were running, we're speaking during a tube strike. Well, so you can get rid of your car. Well, you have a nice bottle of wine when you go out for meals. Surely you can do without nice. And it goes on and on and on. And all these things that sort of constitute our lives are really dispensable in comparison to what's at stake. So I have a thought experiment which I describe, not my own. It's a guy called Theron Pummer, but I think it's a very interesting thought experiment where he imagines that there's a green button that you can press, and if you fail to press it every 5 seconds, somebody will die. And it looks like you're just tied to the green button forever because you're allowed lube breaks and maybe you're allowed to go off and eat maybe, but you're tied to that green button. If you don't press it, somebody's going to die. Now, whatever you can think of doing, it can't be as important as the fact that you could be saving a life. So it looks like you're tied to that green button. But Pummer says, I don't think this is totally unreasonable. If you look at a life globally, as opposed to at any one particular moment, and say you've got to stick by that green button because what's at stake is more important than whatever else you could be doing, that just does seem to be demanding too much of a life. And so that does seem to sort of add some kind of check on what can be asked of us.
Right. So there's some sort of upper bound of okay, we can always do more, but
it comes to a stage where it's not life as we recognize it, and it's just asking too much of us.
So related to that, I mean, and that's not a counter argument against the shallow pond experiment. Well, it's more just kind of saying okay, there are limits. I mean, are there any compelling counter arguments to the shallow pond? Because I feel like many people might just sort of viscerally feel uncomfortable with it, and discomfort at not doing enough I think is a fair thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the idea is wrong. It's more just you're confronted with a discrepancy between how you live your life and how maybe you should live your life. Have you found any compelling counter arguments?
So the book itself, it tells the story of the shallow pond, but the second half of the book takes 10 objections to the analogy with the real world and treats them with more or less serious regard. I think 1 or 2 are very serious objections. I think 1 or 2 are trivial objections, but I think there are some serious objections to it. I mean, I think the most serious objection is not philosophical, it's empirical. And that is that the assumption that you can give a certain amount of money away and it will save a life, or will be part of a causal chain that will save a life, is too narrowly focused. So some of these organizations that have sprung up as part of the effective altruism movement, they look at how effective charities are. And some of these charities, for example, charities that end up trying to purchase malaria nets in places where malaria is very high and it takes a lot of lives. They look like very effective charities. Malaria nets are very cheap and they're very effective. So these organizations are very good at crunching the numbers. So they recognize that the data is complicated by a number of factors. So, for example, there'll be some people who weren't going to get malaria in any case. So the bed net is not doing them any good. There are some people who wouldn't use the net appropriately, or they might use it to go fishing or something like that. There are some nets that will be faulty, blah, 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 blah. So you have to include all that in the calculation about how many bed nets you need to buy to save a life. And then there's the cost of the charity and the cost of distribution, blah, 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 blah. So they do all that. But the objection that people like Angus Deaton, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist at Princeton, who was extremely helpful to me in the writing of the book, I think the objection they make is that spotlights a problem too much, and that the wider picture is that when you give aid to a country, it has all sorts of distorting effects that aren't included in that kind of calculation. In particular, aid ends up rupturing the relationship between the state and the citizen. Because if an NGO is doing the work that the state should do, then the state feels no accountability to the citizen, which means that the state can use its money to start wars. It can lead to an increase in corruption. It just leads to bad governance. And you want the state responsible for important aspects of citizens' lives, and you want the citizens to be able to hold the state accountable. And if the money is not coming from the state doesn't need to feel accountable because somebody else is doing its work for it.
Right. So it can have this sort of kind of warping effect of, so even though, yeah, you think, okay, maybe we're safe, but long term, it doesn't actually do the kind of, and I think more broadly, right, there's just kind of this highly nonlinear, highly nonlinear complex nature to society and civilization and humanity. And it's very hard to kind of tease out one little portion of this large system and say, okay, we're going to make an impact here or some sort of intervention, and that will actually do what we expect. I still think, I mean, it's certainly worthy of trying, and I'm glad people are actually trying to quantify these kinds of things. And certainly, like, in the kind of the near term, if these people need help, there's something to be said. And I think that's kind of like the counter argument for some of this is like, in the near term, something still might need to be done. Just how do you kind of balance these kinds of things, as well as the fact that maybe there's this to actually understanding the impacts of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I think all that is right. Of course, one shouldn't use it as an excuse not to try anything. It's the same with every aspect of government, that it's incredibly complicated, whether it's trying to tank, tinker with the education system, whether it's trying to tinker with the health system. These are very complicated, vast networks of institutions and individuals. The social world is very complicated, and you can never be sure precisely what effect you're going to have. And that's a reason to have projects and to have trials and to have randomized control experiments and so on. There's also, as you mentioned, the issue about short term and long term. So it's very interesting to me that the effective altruists are often accused of being influenced, which they are, by utilitarian thinking. They're not, by all means, all utilitarian, but certainly a percentage of them are, and Peter Singer is. And they're sort of criticized for that, for all sorts of independent reasons, that utilitarianism is objectionable to its opponents for various reasons. But this argument that we shouldn't give aid because it has these distorting effects is precisely a utilitarian argument. Because it's saying that, well, damn what happens in the short term, let these people suffer, because long term, that's going to be the best outcome. That is a utilitarian argument. So they're using a utilitarian argument, and they criticize effective altruism for its connection to utilitarianism. So I think there's a sort of irony there.
Do you think, and given sort of the complexity of the world, do you feel like the effective altruism community, and my sense is they do kind of have this like proper like level of like epistemic humility of like when they're, because there's a lot of quantification and trying to measure all these kinds of things, but that often has to be tempered by recognizing, okay, these calculations are tentative, they might change. There's probably lots of unanticipated consequences and things. Like, is that part of the ethos within the community? Because and I feel like maybe it's more within the community, but maybe not as much messaged externally. I don't know. How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right again. I think they're quite humble about those sorts of things. And you've got to remember that when they're comparing charities and their levels of effectiveness, there's very complicated arguments about what counts as effectiveness, how you measure effectiveness. But if you take certain sort of premises about what matters, that the degree of difference between the most effective and the least effective is so vast that if their numbers are a bit out, it doesn't matter. If the numbers are a bit fuzzy, it doesn't matter because there's still a huge divergence between the very effective and the least effective. So, to insist that their numbers are accurate to 8 decimal points would of course be absurd. But to claim that they've got some rough handle on the figures seems perfectly reasonable to me.
Yeah, like having like even just like an order of magnitude kind of sense of, okay, if this thing is going to be whether or not it's 50 times better versus 100 times better. We still know it's a lot better, and that is kind of useful. Are there any, when you were going through the different counter arguments, I feel like most of them you didn't find particularly compelling. That was my sense. Are there any that the proponents of those arguments feel that they are like that they think are really, really strong, but you're like, these are ridiculous. Like, these are not powerful arguments at all. But somehow the people who are proponents of these counter arguments think they're really compelling?
In that category, I can think of just one, which is something we've sort of touched on, which is that people accuse the effective altruist and Peter Singer of dealing with these problems at an individualistic level, and that what really matters is structural. Might be to do with trade balances, it might be to do with international laws, it might be to do with governance, that is what would really fix the problem. And to that, I think the answer is, well, fine. Firstly, if you think that's the answer to this problem of terrible poverty in parts of the world, well, get working on it.
Right, start working on it.
Okay. If you think that's the problem, get working on it. And if you're not doing that, then it seems tough to criticize people who are at least doing something. Secondly, there may well be room in the world for multiple strategies. So there's room in the world for people to send money to international charities and for NGOs to do their work. There's also room in the world for people to work on these bigger picture structural stuff. And thirdly, if you could genuinely convince the effective altruists that this is the most effective use.
Right, they would switch all of their resources.
They would switch. It's not that they are ideologically stuck on this idea of individual donations to international charities. It's just that they've come to the conclusion that this is the most direct way that they can do good and most likely to do good. But if they could be convinced that there was a more effective way of producing a better outcome, well, they would be willing to switch.
And related to that, I feel like in the past, I don't know, 5-6 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, there has been somewhat of a switch, not necessarily switching all the effort within the effective altruism community, but a lot of effort has been focused more on certain aspects of long-termism and existential risk, certainly around like AI risk and things like that. I don't know if you can talk about some of that kind of shift, what sort of precipitated that, and how you kind of think about that shift and its impact on the movement.
Yeah, I think it's had a damaging impact on the movement. The shift itself has been understandable, I think. So if you're interested in doing good in the world, well, there are all sorts of ways you can do good in the world, and philanthropy is just one of them. There are at least two other causes that the effective altruists have become interested in. One is animal rights, and often there's an easy hit there. And interestingly, the effective altruists who work on animal rights have been working at an institutional level rather than donating to stray dogs sort of thing. So trying to change legislation, trying to improve laws about factory farming and so on. And I think they've been very effective. So that's one area. And the second area that they've moved into are these existential risk issues that you talk about, which might be concerns about future pandemics, might be nuclear war, might be AI and the threat from AI and whether that in fact threatens human life, might be meteors, might be all sorts of things. I think it's sort of inspired by a philosopher who I wrote a biography about called Derek Parfit. And he is the philosopher who basically invents the philosophy of future people, which is the philosophy about how we should think about people who will be on the planet but are not yet here. And his basic insight, which I'm sure is correct, is that future interests matter as much as current interests. We may want to sort of not treat them exactly as identical because of uncertainty. So
Sure.
it may be the case that we can't be sure what the future is going to be. We know what the present is, so we should value a current life more than we value a future life because we don't know whether that future life is going to come into existence. And there's all sorts of other aspects of uncertainty that we can't be clear about. But that doesn't mean that morally a future life is no less valuable than a current life. And he has this, he has lots of thought experiments, but the simplest one where is he imagines that some glass is left in a forest and a child steps on it today and cuts their foot. Now that's a bad thing, but you can also imagine that that piece of glass stays in the undergrowth for 100 years, and in 100 years' time, another child steps on that glass and hurts its foot. Part of its basic insight is that's just as bad.
Right.
It's no less bad just because that person doesn't yet exist. But if you go down that line, you get to all sorts of puzzles. So clearly, so long as we don't blow ourselves up, there are many more people in the future than there have been in the past, not least because when our population of 8 billion, our population sort of doubled in whatever it is, 40 years or so, 50 years. So there are many more people in the future than there are currently. So it looks like the future is much more important than the present. And if you end up thinking that way, you might downgrade the interests of the present for the interests of the future. So it leads to all sorts of puzzles and paradoxes and problems. And also people, I think, just can't find in themselves to have kind of sympathy for the concerns about AI compared to people who are short of drinking water in certain parts of the world. Those have a much more immediate hold on our emotions. So I think it's had a bad effect for the effective altruist because people think they've gone off on these theoretical directions. They've moved away from the original focus. I think Peter Singer himself thinks that it's gone too far, that he wishes that the focus was much more on what the shallow pond was all about, which was helping distant strangers. I can quite understand why they take these other interests seriously, but I just think from a PR point of view, it has had a bad effect on them.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, yeah, to what degree do you feel that it's like more of like a branding issue versus kind of philosophically confused? I imagine some of the reasoning behind this, I mean, in addition to kind of like the philosophical arguments, is that a non-trivial number of people who are involved in the effective altruism community are also very interested in AI and certain existential risks and things like that. And so I imagine if there is a philosophically compelling reason to focus on those kinds of things and focus on the research, it has a nice alignment of like, oh, I can actually be a really good, like a member in good standing of EA while still doing the things that I'm very interested in. So, and some people might then say, oh, well, maybe you're just kind of, it's like a sort of motivated reason kind of thing. But are there philosophical concerns from your perspective in terms of the focus on long-termism and certain aspects of existential risk? Or is it more of just they're no longer focused on kind of the here and now and the immediacy, and that is going to harm the brand?
So at an abstract level, I think it's philosophically perfectly coherent. I think it does lead to a lot of motivated reasoning. So it does end up justifying a lot of things just because you can say, oh, well, the future of humanity matters. So I can take this extremely well paid job in blah, 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 because I'm still doing a really good thing. So I think there is a lot of motivated reasoning going on. I think philosophically it's coherent. I think for branding reasons, it may have made sense to categorize them separately, as it were, to have different buckets. I mean, I think most effective altruists, although the movement, I think, outside has become seen as very associated with Silicon Valley, often with, techno bros and very rich people. I think most effective altruists, A, are not wealthy, B, are very generous, much more generous than most of us, and C, do devote quite a lot of their resources to the traditional causes. But I think it has been a marketing problem.
It feels as if there are many people who are unhappy with EA or just kind of dislike it in like this very kind of visceral way. Is that because it's been captured by some of those kinds of things? I feel like there might be something underlying that distaste as well. I don't know if maybe you can like psychoanalyze the people who are very unhappy with the effective altruism community and maybe give kind of a sense of like, yeah, why there is such a strong reaction.
Yeah, so I have a chapter on this because it puzzles me a great deal, because on the face of it, there are a bunch of idealistic, mostly relatively young people who seem well-intentioned and are being very generous. And they do arouse an enormous amount of hostility. And I think it is very puzzling. I think there are lots of reasons for it. One we touched on, I think people are skeptical about long-termism. They're skeptical about some of the claims about the damage that AI might do. I'm not an AI expert, so I don't feel in the position to adjudicate in that debate. I think also, although the EA people are not on the whole preachy, when you see a group of people who are behaving in a certain way out of a moral stance, it can't but help reflect on people who haven't adopted the same stance. So, although they don't go around criticizing the rest of us who aren't as generous as they are, I think people do take it, quite rightly, I think, as an implicit condemnation of the way everybody else leads their lives. And so people get defensive about it. And that's totally natural. I remember I'm quite old now, but I became a vegetarian 4 decades ago. And I remember, so I was an early vegetarian, and actually I was in part persuaded by the arguments of Peter Singer, who, we haven't mentioned this, as well as this thought experiment about the shallow pond. He really is the father of animal rights. He wouldn't call them animal rights. He's a utilitarian. He doesn't believe in rights, but he's the father of what we call the animal rights movement, focused on animal welfare. And again, his arguments are very, very convincing and compelling, and he's been very influential. And I was influenced by his arguments and became vegetarian when there were very few vegetarians around. And I remember amongst my parents' generation then just meeting an extraordinary amount of hostility. And I think it was a result of the same effect that I've never tried to convert anybody unless they want an argument about
Right.
it.
But it's just like your very existence
Yeah.
is implicating them.
Yeah.
You've mentioned before that the effective altruism movement is distinct from utilitarianism, but it does seem as if there is a lot of overlap. And how do these communities think about each other?
There's definitely an overlap in that a much higher percentage of the effective altruism movement would self-identify as utilitarian than the population as a whole. Well, the population as a whole wouldn't know what utilitarianism was, I think, but
That is fair.
nonetheless, if these different moral theories were explained to them, I don't think many people would sign up to utilitarianism in the Singer sense, in that he thinks it's the ultimate way of telling right from wrong, as it were, and other people will believe that there are constraints independent of utilitarianism, like lying or promise keeping or something, which can't be explained entirely in utilitarian terms. So I think lots of the effective altruists are utilitarians. By no means all. I think both McCaskill and Ord, the two founders of effective altruism, have done their best to distance themselves from utilitarianism. There was, of course, this disaster a couple of years ago with Sam Bankman-Fried, who did self-identify as a utilitarian and was then found guilty of fraud. He became a billionaire. He founded a cryptocurrency. He was worth $26 billion at his peak, and then it all collapsed. And it turned out he'd been up to dodgy business. And he was a utilitarian, and he came from, as it were, a utilitarian family, which is very unusual. So that cemented the link in people's minds between effective altruism and utilitarianism, and gave effective altruism a very bad reputation, and linked it closer with utilitarianism. So I think it's partly because of that scandal that people see it as a more utilitarian movement than it actually is.
And from the way you're talking about this, I assume you do not identify as a utilitarian.
I do not, actually, although I think as a younger man, I did. I think as a student, it seemed very convincing to me. But I think the objections, which we haven't got time to go into because that's a whole big debate,
That's fair.
I find them too convincing. So I'm not a utilitarian. I mean, what the effective altruists say is that at least a part of one's life, and a part of the good life, should be caring about impartially about the interests of strangers. And I can sign up to that. That seems right to me. But I guess a utilitarian goes much further and says, although there are utilitarian reasons for preferring one's own child to somebody else's child, in fact, they're of equal value from the point of view of the universe. And a strict utilitarian is much more impartial than most of us are. But the effective altruists say that for a portion of one's life, one should think about the world in this impartial, slightly utilitarian way.
Would you consider yourself a part of the EA community?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
Okay.
I wouldn't. Um, uh, I've been to a few EA conferences, and I've been convinced by their arguments, but I'm not part of them. I see myself as an outsider observing them from the outside, but I'm much more sympathetic to them
Okay, I was
than
going to say,
most people.
my sense was you're kind of sympathetic and maybe kind of like a fellow traveler, but not necessarily formally part
Well, I
of the
wouldn't even
community.
call myself a fellow traveler. No,
Okay.
I'm sympathetic to them. I've never been part of EA. They are much more generous than I am. I'm doing my best. So I wouldn't call myself an effective altruist, but I find most of what they do very commendable.
I love the fact that you wrote this biography of a thought experiment, and I also find it very interesting that this thought experiment has had a very meaningful impact in the world. And my sense is it's not the only one of these kinds of thought experiments. And you talked about certain other ones that have also had impacts. I mean, how do you think about like the role of thought experiments in kind of clarifying things? And one of the chapters in terms of the counter arguments was, I think, a number of people actually pushing back on the efficacy of thought experiments because they're kind of in this weird sort of like platonic realm of ideas, and the actual world is quite messy. But at the same time, though, thought experiments really clarify a lot of things, and can actually create real world impact. How do you think about the kind of impact that thought experiments can or should have?
Well, I like them. I wrote a book about 12 years ago called Would You Kill the Fat Man? And The Shallow Pond is probably the second most famous thought experiment in history of moral philosophy. And The Trolley Problem is
Exactly.
probably the most famous thought experiment in the history of moral philosophy. And I wrote a whole book on that. So in some ways the Death in the Shallow Pond is a kind of companion piece to
Yeah.
Would You Kill the Fat Man? Philosophy has used thought experiments from time immemorial. Plato used thought experiments. Plato's got thought experiment about the ring of Gyges. About he imagines that you could put on a ring, and that would make you invisible. And he imagines how people would react if they were invisible. And he has a very bad view of human nature. He thinks that we would behave in a very selfish way if we could get away with it. And that's a thought experiment. Every part of philosophy uses thought experiments. Philosophy of mind uses thought experiments. There's a very famous thought experiment called the Chinese Room. Another very famous thought experiment called What Mary Knew. Those are both thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. The thought experiments in the philosophy of language. Every area of philosophy uses thought experiments. It tends to be only moral philosophy thought experiments which receive such criticism. And that's because people think that you can't necessarily extrapolate from a thought experiment to the real world. I mean, the defense of thought experiments is that the reason why they're often quite bizarre is that the real world is very complicated. And if you're trying to test a principle, you want to shut out all the white noise of the real world, all these complicating factors. And if you're comparing, like you do in a scientific laboratory experiment, if you're comparing two factors, you want to keep everything equal,
Right. You
apart
need to
from just
control
one
for everything
factor.
else. Yeah.
Control for everything else. Now, you can't do that in the real world because there's just too much going on. But in a thought experiment, you can do that. And you can see what your intuitions are if you just change one factor. And I think that can be illuminating. I mean, it's not the only way to do moral philosophy, but as one tool in the philosopher's toolbox, I think it's quite useful. It's interesting to me that they have such power, these thought experiments. In Peter Singer's original article, which Famine, Affluence and Morality, The Shallow Pond, which I wrote a whole book about, gets about 4 lines. And then somewhere along the line, Peter and various other people begin to realize how powerful an image it is. And then subsequently, he wrote a book called The Life You Can Save, which was basically based on The Shallow Pond. He realized that is the vehicle through which to conduct the whole argument. And it's partly because they work so well. If they've got some narrative, if they're sort of straightforward like this, they work extremely well. They can be very powerful in influencing people. I think that's one reason why people use them. There are sometimes these very complicated articles, and all anybody remembers about them is the thought experiment in the middle of them.
Are there any thought experiments, particularly in moral philosophy, that you feel should have a much greater impact in kind of the wider world beyond just within moral philosophy?
Oh, blimey. Any other ones? Well, I think, to be honest, most of them don't have an impact beyond philosophy. There's a famous one that Judith Jarvis Thompson has. She was a philosopher at MIT, has about abortion. And it's about somebody who wakes up and finds themselves tied to a famous violinist. And they're told that they're the only one whose blood is compatible with the famous violinist. And if they deplug themselves from this famous violinist, the famous violinist will die. But don't worry, you only need to stay plugged into them for 9 months. And then you're free to go, and the violinist will survive, because the violinist was going to die unless they had this source of blood. And it's a very interesting thought experiment. What she says is trying to argue is that even if we grant the fact that a fetus has the same moral status as a human being, which is a very contestable premise, even if we grant that, it's still not the case that you're obligated to remain attached to another human being to save that human being's, or to keep that human being alive. So she was later part of a submission with a number of philosophers to the Supreme Court about a abortion debate, but I don't think it really had any effect. The trolley problem, I think, likewise hasn't had much effect in the real world. It is taught, well, as far as I know, still is. It wasn't until very recently, by every officer at West Point. They're taught about the trolley problem because they're taught about the difference between deliberately killing civilians and
versus like by inaction or something like that.
Yeah, and killing civilians, knowing that you're going to kill civilians but not intending to do so. So it's known as the doctrine of double effect in philosophy, and so it's, as I say, it's taught in the US military. So that's some kind of effect, but it's really to support an intuition that we all have in any case. I think it may become more influential, perhaps, with the arrival of the driverless car.
Yeah, I was going to say autonomous vehicles. You probably have to start programming answers, like solutions to these various trolley problem scenarios.
Right, to some extent. Even then, its effect will probably be minimal. We'll see. Because, I mean, one hopes that the driverless car, which is not very far away for most of us, the driverless car will be, one hopes, very effective, so that if something drops in front of it, it will be able to stop immediately, and it won't need to swerve to the left and have a choice between killing one and swerving to the right and killing
It is
four.
a very contrived situation.
Yeah.
Maybe a good place to end would be I would love it if you can maybe share kind of what do you think should be, or you hope would be the takeaway from a reader of this book. Is it about the impact of philosophy on the real world? Is it about convincing people to give more? Is it a little bit of both? I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on what the hoped for takeaway would be.
So Peter Singer says philosophy shouldn't be about chess puzzles, but I'm a chess player and I love chess puzzles. So ultimately, I think these things are fascinating. So they're just intrinsically very, very interesting.
Completely.
And this is intrinsically a very interesting puzzle. Does this thought experiment, is it an analogy with the real world? If not, why not? That's a very, very interesting question. But it is also an important question. So if you then decide, having been through the arguments, that the analogy holds, at least to some degree, then it may indeed force you to reconsider how you live your life.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. This is a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it.